You remember from the last session when we were talking about whether neoliberalism has the status of a utopia, that I mentioned this thing, the Mount Pelerin Society, where supposedly all this neoliberal doctrine was being cooked up for the last 70 years. Well, the name of the group, when it was founded in the 1930s, was the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. Now, I mentioned Walter Lippmann, who's probably the most important journalist in the United States of the 20th century, because he was the person in debate with John Dewey about the nature of the public, right, defending the position that John was just talking about, where in a sense the state doesn't want the public involved, it wants politics to be run by experts who are technocrats, etc. It was in this context, in this debate with Dewey in the 1920s, that Lippmann coined the phrase, which then got used ironically by Noam Chomsky, manufacturing consent. For Lippmann, this was a good thing, right? And one of the people in the audience talking about how neoliberalism is constantly churning out all of this propaganda and misinformation about poverty and wealth and so forth, so as a result people are completely confused about what's going on. Well, in a sense, that was part of the original idea as a way of getting people to at least trust that that things are so complicated that only the experts know for sure how to run society, and so as a result one shouldn't oneself get involved in politics. One should tend to the sorts of things that one has direct knowledge of, direct experience of, and so forth. So I think that's a very important kind of connection here to make. Also, I think the other point that needs to be made here, and I'm going to be a little polemical with regard to John, is that in a sense talking about John Dewey is, as we say in America, sort of waving a flag and kissing a baby, right? Everybody loves him. The amazing thing about this man is how ineffectual he has been. Okay, in other words, Walter Lippmann actually did have a lot of impact in terms of shaping the vision of what became of neoliberalism. But what has John Dewey done? Well, he shaped as it were, the rhetoric of a lot of academics when they get into aspirational mode. Because, of course, this happens over and over, generation after generation. Richard Rorty did in the last generation. And it's not clear what discernible impact this has actually had in the politics of anything. So, I mean, in a sense, this is not to say that what John Dewey wanted and what John's been espousing here isn't a good thing, but the point is the institutions have not yet been put in place, and all we get is a kind of recycling of the rhetoric with every new political and economic crisis we go through. So that's an interesting point in itself. I want to take the issue about the defense of the university to a kind of, you might say, more foundational, you might even call it fundamentalist level, if you think about fundamentalist Protestants and the mixed feelings I'm sure those people create in the audience here. I have a fundamentalist view of the university, which is not the Clark Kerr view, which of the multiversity, where in a sense the university is doing a lot of different things, some public, some private, some having to do with knowledge in the strict sense and some not, but rather talking about the Humboldt, right, the Wilhelm von Humboldt model of the modern university, where we talk about the idea that the point of the university is somehow the unity of teaching and research. Right, and that's the primary function of the university, and it's in that context that the university manufactures knowledge as a public good. This is how I would put it. Okay, and that's the notion of the public university that I'm interested in defending. I'm not against the kinds of issues that John is raising at all, but I do think in a sense if one is talking about, is there a core thing about the university that distinguishes it from other institutions and other organizations, I would put this on the table. Because research and teaching need not be done by the same people in the same place under the same institutional arrangements, right? And in fact, research and teaching to a large extent are quite different sorts of activities prima facie. And I think one of the ways in which we realize this increasingly is the fact that they're measured and judged in radically different ways. And this is one of the things that's kind of splitting apart the university today. But it's sort of, that problem has always been there. Because research in a sense is an inherently elite activity. In the sense, the whole point of doing research is to get some kind of, coming up with something new that will, in a sense, put you ahead of others. And which others are we talking about? It depends. It could just be your colleagues working in a particular field, or it could, of course, have more commercial and political consequences if you come up with knowledge that is really of revolutionary nature in a more practical realm. And in fact, during the period that we call the Enlightenment, one of the reasons why the Enlightenment wits were very interested in creating academies and research institutes was to give a kind of competitive advantage to ambitious nation states. But this had nothing to do with teaching. This had something to do with providing knowledge that rulers would be able to use. right? So client-driven, as we might put it today. But of course, universities don't just do that. Universities also teach, and in fact, the two functions are related. And so whatever initial advantage that research provides the researchers or their funders, because of its very elite, cutting-edge nature, gets dissipated through the classroom as this research then gets translated into modes that people who were not originally trained in the areas come to understand. And of course, we've institutionalized this in lots of ways through disciplinary majors and so forth, where you can come in not knowing anything at all, and gradually we teach you everything so that you can, in fact, be someone who understands sufficiently what's going on in these cutting-edge areas, that if you want, you yourself could make a contribution, and in fact, you could be taking it in directions other than those of the people who initially produced it. Now, this is a very important point, right? Because what's going on here with the teaching function, when applied to the research function, is destroying any initial advantage. And that's part of the democratizing function of the university, is the teaching function. If the research function is not connected to the teaching function, it's not clear how the university is a vehicle of democratization. Okay? And so, of course, we're living in times where these two functions are increasingly split apart. And so, insofar as the university is serving this purpose of manufacturing knowledge as a public good, the separation of the teaching and the research is a very bad sign. Because what one might imagine instead is that, in a sense, what universities are increasingly doing is manufacturing knowledge as a variety of privately enjoyed goods, right? So credentials, for example, which get you a job in the job market. So maybe you might call this a positional good, right? Gives you a certain advantage in a market. Or the same thing might be said for research. Universities produce research that enables them to get a certain kind of advantage, or the people who produce it, whatever, financial, intellectual, whatever. But it doesn't necessarily produce a public good. What you just get is the proliferation of intellectual property. And this is kind of what is happening now. And our measurements of what goes on in university activities are heading increasingly in that direction. So on the table, at the very least, is the idea that if we want to talk about measuring university as a producer of public goods, we need some kind of measure that manages to integrate what goes on the research side and what goes on the teaching side. We cannot have these two functions being measured in a disaggregated fashion, which is the way things are now. Okay? Now I say this because I don't want to take off the table the idea that we can measure things. I think the problem at the moment is we just tend to measure whatever is most easily measurable, and too many academics, in a way, see it beneath them to think about some kind of integrated notion of measurement that actually shows the power of the university as a public good. Now there's another issue that's also quite tricky here. And in a way, the multiversity idea was originally designed to address this. And this was the idea that in order for knowledge to be manufactured as a public good, everybody needs to have access to it in some direct kind of way. So that there's some sort of intrinsic value in everyone going to university. Okay, that's somehow taken for granted. That wasn't always taken for granted, of course, and not even under the heyday of the welfare state, when you had maybe 20% of the population going to university, but everybody in the country subsidizing the taxes through their taxes for these people to do that. But back in those days, the public benefit that universities were supposed to provide were not necessarily tied to whatever credential or whatever you got at the end of the time you were there, but rather was seen in terms of a much more longer-term, larger-scale macroeconomic picture, where there would be multiplier effects so that these relatively few people who got the university education would be able to do things that in the long term benefited society, right, through whatever medical innovations, industrial processes, things of this kind. Okay? So as it were, knowledge as a public good did not necessarily have to involve the participation of everyone in order for it to be realized. Okay? Now, of course, we live in somewhat different times where there's this kind of pressure that, in a sense, that for knowledge to be truly a public good, we sort of think that everybody should have access to it. Now, this can have some diabolical effects, and this is the kind of thing that Alison Wolfe has talked about in the book, Does Education Matter? And this came out a few years ago now, and the idea, and in a way, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that it's only the higher education sector that is really taken seriously in terms of international comparisons. But the basic point is that one of the consequences of the expansion of higher education has been a neglect of primary and secondary school education in terms of funding, in terms of interest, in terms of evaluation. And what this has meant is that basically a lot of the skills and a lot of the knowledge and whatever that would have been transmitted at those lower levels are now kind of pushed up, right? So in a sense, a lot of our universities become kind of remedial schools with regard to things that in previous generations would have been handled. And I might add, we're not just talking about reading and writing and so forth, but I'm also talking about the issue that's been raised here about the need to go to university in order to get citizenship, right? Because I think in the end there's always this kind of bottom line notion that one of the points of having everybody go to university is that they get the sort of knowledge and the skills and so forth that enables them to be citizens that is above and beyond whatever kind of vocational training they get at university. Prima facie that sounds good, but the interesting thing would be, well, let's look at the detail of that. What kind of citizenship education are we talking about here? Of course we are talking about something, but is it not something that could be also delivered at the secondary school level? Or does it require a university? Could it not be part of some sort of other tertiary sector institution and not a university? Okay, so it seems to me that these are kinds of quite important questions, because at the moment, putting all the emphasis on universities and making sure that we have all the ones that we currently have now, and that this is the place where knowledge is made a public good and nowhere else, and really trying to stress that so strongly, as a matter of political fact, is leading to a neglect of these other sectors of the education system, and especially in this country, where we really do not have joined-up education policy, right? Where you have people like David Willits doing his thing, and we have Michael Gove doing his thing, right? And they're not part of even the same ministry. Okay, this is a great example of the problem that we have in this country. But I do think that's a very serious matter, that in a sense, those of us who are concerned about the future of knowledge as a public good, we should not just be defending universities, and all the universities that happen to be in existence now, but we should also be concerned about the future of primary and secondary education. Okay, and we should have, as it were, some kind of consolidated, joined-up view about this matter, which may mean that some of the things that we call universities now do not necessarily need to exist. Okay, and that something else needs to happen to them. At least we should be opening up that kind of discussion. So, I mean, I realize that this is a very controversial sort of thing to say, but I do believe that in a sense, we really need to not... Otherwise, it seems to me that we can very easily look like we're just self-interested. That in a sense, all we're concerned about keeping our jobs and keeping our student numbers and so forth, and we're not really concerned with, as it were, the kind of more... spiritual issue, you might say, of trying to protect knowledge as a public good and making it as available to people as possible. It is not at all clear that having as many universities as we have now is the best way to do it. Okay? There are other ways, and we need to be thinking about that. How much more time would you say I have? 1 minute? Okay. Obviously, I can't say everything I wanted to. I think the other thing I think that needs to be mentioned here is that sometimes when I make this kind of argument, people would say, well, it's been shown that in the United Kingdom that entry into higher education is actually the most reliable form of social mobility in this country. Okay, this argument gets made. I'm willing to accept this at face value. However, I do think that this has to be seen against the backdrop of the fact that this country does not have a history of affirmative action. Okay, so in other words, having lots of institutions of higher education that take in all kinds of people, in a way, functions in this country in the way in which in the United States, much more state-directed, saying, look, you have to get people from certain kinds of poor backgrounds, certain kinds of traditional disadvantaged backgrounds going to universities. And so that a lot of those kinds of concerns about social mobility need not be addressed directly just by expanding university numbers and expanding places for universities, but rather by the structuring of the kind of people